There's a strange, almost surreal paradox playing out everywhere in politics, on social media, in your office, even at your family dinner table. You've seen it. The loudest person in the room is often the least informed. The one who speaks with the most confidence knows the least. Meanwhile, the people who actually do understand, the ones who've read the books, wrestled with the ideas, and questioned themselves, are the ones who hesitate, second-guess, and remain silent. Why does it seem like the more someone knows, the less certain they are, while the less they know, the more loudly they proclaim their genius? This isn't just annoying, it's dangerous. Because when the ignorant believe they're experts, and the knowledgeable begin to doubt themselves, the world starts listening to the wrong voices. Voices that are louder, simpler, more entertaining, but not wiser. And this is where the Dunning-Kruger effect comes in. It's not just a psychological bias. It's a mirror held up to our collective ego. And once you see it, truly see it, you'll start to question everything: who you trust, how you think, and most importantly, what you think you know.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
The Dunning-Kruger effect, in its simplest form, says this: people with low ability at a task tend to overestimate their ability, while those with high ability tend to underestimate theirs. But that's just the surface. The deeper meaning is far more disturbing. It suggests that the more ignorant you are, the less capable you are of recognizing your own ignorance. That's not just a gap in knowledge, that's a blindfold. And it explains so much about the modern world: why misinformation spreads faster than facts, why conspiracy theories flourish, why mediocrity rises while wisdom retreats. It's not because people are stupid. It's because they're confidently unaware. And confidence, in a world that values certainty over substance, is often all it takes to win. Pause and think about that. Have you ever believed something with complete certainty, only to discover later how wrong you were? And that terrifying moment when the floor drops out and you realize you were standing on assumptions, not truth. That's the crack where real growth begins. But here's the problem: most people never get there. Because getting there requires humility. And humility is not rewarded in the algorithms of attention. Let's take a step back. Why does this effect exist in the first place? Why are we so blind to our own limitations? The answer is both psychological and philosophical. Psychologically, it comes down to metacognition, our ability to think about our own thinking, but to evaluate whether we're right, whether we actually understand something. But here's the twist: if you lack knowledge in a domain, you also lack the framework to evaluate your own performance. In other words, you don't know what you don't know, and worse, you don't know that you don't know. That's the trap, and it leads to a frightening conclusion: the people most in need of reflection are often the least likely to do it. Now, let's go deeper, because this isn't just about psychology. This is about philosophy. Socrates once said, "The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing." That's not just poetic. That's a direct antidote to the Dunning-Kruger effect. Socratic wisdom begins with doubt, with the admission that you could be wrong. And that humility becomes the seed of real understanding. But here's the problem. In a culture obsessed with certainty, doubt is seen as weakness. In a world where everyone's expected to have an opinion on everything, the willingness to say "I don't know" feels almost criminal. And that's where the fools take over, because they never pause. They never question. They never reflect. They push forward with conviction, and that conviction, no matter how misinformed, becomes persuasive. And the terrifying truth is, we're wired to trust confidence more than competence. But we assume the person who speaks with certainty must be right. But what if they're not? What if they're just louder? Let's bring this into your life. Think about your workplace, your school, your friend group. How often do you see people rewarded for sounding like they know what they're talking about, even when they don't? How often do you see thoughtful people dismissed because they speak with nuance? This isn't just frustrating, it's systemic. And it leads to a world where decisions are made not by the wisest, but by the most vocal. Not by the reflective, but by the reactive. So what do we do? How do we protect ourselves from this trap, and more importantly, how do we avoid falling into it ourselves? That's where the real work begins. Because the Dunning-Kruger effect doesn't just describe other people. It describes all of us at some point. But every time you enter a new field, every time you learn a little bit and start feeling confident, you're standing on the edge of that curve. And the only thing that will keep you from tumbling down is humility. But the willingness to ask, what am I missing? What don't I know? What could I be wrong about? But here's the twist. That kind of humility requires strength, inner strength. Because it means being okay with not having all the answers. It means being okay with uncertainty. And in a world that sells certainty like candy, choosing doubt is a revolutionary act. So here's the challenge I want to leave you with. Can you become the kind of person who questions your own thoughts more than you question others' beliefs? Can you become the kind of person who doesn't just seek to be right, but seeks to understand? That's what separates the wise from the fools. Not how much they know, but how deeply they're willing to reflect. The fool says, I already know. The wise person asks, what else is there to learn? Let's begin with a haunting truth. Ignorance, when paired with confidence, becomes magnetic. It draws attention, it rallies crowds, it builds platforms. And in a world structured around visibility, the confident fool often rises faster than the cautious seer. This isn't some broken glitch in the system, it is the system. The Dunning-Kruger effect doesn't just live inside people's minds. It lives in the very structures of our politics, our media, our education systems, and even our personal lives. It corrupts power not with evil, but with emptiness. Let's talk about politics. It's the most obvious playground for the Dunning-Kruger dynamic. But we've all seen it. Politicians who speak in absolutes, who simplify complex issues into slogans, who turn public discourse into performance. They say things that are objectively wrong, but they say them with such unshakable confidence that people believe them. Why? Because certainty feels safe. It gives people something to hold on to. And in uncertain times, feeling right becomes more important than being right. Machiavelli warned us about this centuries ago. He said, men in general judge more by the eyes than by the hands. In other words, people believe what they see, what appears true more than what is true. The Dunning-Kruger effect weaponizes this. It turns lack of knowledge into a performance of certainty that looks like leadership. But here's the terrifying catch. When these confident fools gain real power, they begin making decisions that affect millions of lives. And because they lack the self-awareness to question themselves, they never realize how unqualified they are. Now look at your screen. Social media is an amplifier of this phenomenon, that it rewards confidence, not competence, engagement, not integrity. Algorithms don't care if you're right. They care if you're loud. And so, the person who speaks with nuance gets buried, while the person who makes bold, outrageous claims gets shared, liked, and retweeted into digital stardom. This distorts our sense of truth. It creates echo chambers where people reinforce each other's ignorance, mistaking agreement for accuracy. And once that happens, the Dunning-Kruger spiral becomes self-sustaining. The ignorant don't just believe they're right. They now have an audience telling them they're right. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. Have you ever watched someone rise to influence not because they were wise, but because they were willing to say what others weren't, no matter how wrong it was? Have you ever felt silenced, not by censorship, but by the sheer volume of bad ideas drowning out better ones? That's what happens when the Dunning-Kruger effect meets the attention economy. And it's not just sad. It's dangerous. Because we begin to conflate visibility with value, popularity with truth. And in that confusion, the signal gets lost in the noise. But let's not just blame the system. Let's look inward. The Dunning-Kruger effect isn't just out there. It lives in us. In every moment where we favor our instincts over evidence, where we cling to opinions we haven't tested, where we reject new information because it threatens our ego. Here's the paradox. The more we believe others are trapped in Dunning-Kruger, the more likely we are to be trapped by it ourselves. Because it inflates the ego with a sense of superiority. At least I'm not them, we think. But tell me honestly, how often do you question your own certainty? How often do you seek out perspectives that challenge you? How often do you say, I was wrong? It takes courage to say that, and that's why the people who should lead often don't. They're too busy reflecting. They're too aware of their limitations. They're too concerned with getting it right to rush into the spotlight. But the spotlight doesn't wait. It finds the next confident voice. And so the cycle continues. The loudest rise, the wisest hesitate, and the world listens to the wrong messengers. This isn't just a social problem, it's a personal one. Because when you live in a world dominated by overconfident ignorance, it changes you. You begin to question your own intelligence, but you start wondering if your hesitation is weakness. You feel pressure to speak louder, to simplify, to play the same game. But that's the trap. Because the moment you abandon depth for applause, you become part of the problem. So what do we do? How do we break the cycle? First, we must rebuild our relationship with humility. Real humility isn't weakness, it's strength. It's the strength to admit you don't know, to ask better questions, to listen more than you speak. Humility doesn't mean silence. It means precision. It means knowing that your words carry weight and using them carefully. In a world of noise, the one who speaks quietly but with clarity becomes a lighthouse. Second, we must cultivate intellectual discipline. That means reading beyond headlines, challenging your own beliefs, seeking complexity instead of shunning it. It means understanding that reality doesn't fit into 280 characters, that truth is often slow, subtle, and uncomfortable. But it's worth it. Because when you build your mind with discipline, you become immune to the seduction of easy answers. Third, we must recognize that true leadership begins with self-awareness. The greatest leaders aren't the ones who claim to know everything. They're the ones who surround themselves with people who challenge them, who say, "I don't know more than I'm certain," who understand that wisdom is not a possession, it's a practice. And finally, we must protect the places where truth can still breathe. Our conversations, our friendships, our personal spaces. Create environments where it's safe to question, to doubt, to be wrong. Because in a world addicted to certainty, creating room for uncertainty is an act of rebellion. Let me ask you something that could change your life. What if the next time you felt absolutely certain, you paused and asked, "Where might I be wrong?" What if you made that your habit? What if you trained your mind not to seek victory in arguments, but insight in confusion? That one shift could change everything. In the final part of this journey, we're going to explore how to live beyond the Dunning-Kruger effect, not just as an intellectual exercise, but as a way of life. We'll talk about how to cultivate real wisdom, how to lead from a place of reflection instead of reaction, and how to become the kind of person whose presence raises the level of thought in the room. Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs people who can think. Let's start with a powerful image, a lighthouse. It doesn't move. It doesn't shout. It doesn't chase ships or scream for attention. It simply stands anchored, unwavering, quietly casting light in every direction. That's what it means to think clearly in a world drowning in noise. To live as a lighthouse is to become a presence that cuts through the fog not with volume, but with clarity. Not with arrogance, but with depth. And in an age where the Dunning-Kruger effect has crowned the overconfident and silenced the wise, we need more lighthouses. But how do we become one? We begin by redefining what it means to know. Most people think knowledge is about answers, about having the correct information. But real knowing begins in the space of not knowing. That's what Socrates understood when he said, "I know that I know nothing." It wasn't false modesty, it was intellectual precision. He understood that the more you learn, the larger the unknown becomes. That wisdom isn't about accumulating facts, but about sharpening your awareness of how little you truly grasp. So the first step is this: embrace the unknown. Don't run from it. Don't cover it with false certainty. Sit with it. Let it stretch you. The Dunning-Kruger effect thrives in people who can't tolerate ambiguity. But the wise person learns to breathe in the grey, to listen in the silence, to hold the question without rushing to the answer. Take a moment and ask yourself something almost no one ever asks. What ideas do I believe so strongly that I've never questioned them? What if those are the very places I'm blind? What if my deepest certainty is my biggest vulnerability? This kind of inquiry isn't weakness, it's strength. Because it inoculates you against the illusion of competence. It humbles you. And in that humility, you become dangerous in the best way. You become someone who can't be manipulated by surface-level confidence. Someone who sees through the mask of false genius. Someone who thinks where others react. But thinking clearly isn't enough. The lighthouse doesn't just stand, it shines. And to shine in a world that doesn't think clearly, you have to do something most people are too afraid to do: speak with both honesty and restraint. That means knowing when to engage and when to walk away, when to offer insight and when to simply hold space. Because not every argument is worth entering. Not every platform is worth climbing. In a world where everyone is trying to be seen, the wise aim to be understood. Let's talk about leadership, because this is where the Dunning-Kruger effect does the most damage. In companies, communities, even families, the confident often rise faster than the competent. But here's the secret: their rise is usually short-lived, because they build on sand, on illusions. And when the storm comes, when complexity hits, when reality pushes back, they crumble. Meanwhile, the lighthouse stands, not because it shouted louder, but because its foundation was truth. So if you want to lead, don't chase attention. Don't mimic the fools. Build your mind like a fortress. Read, reflect. Surround yourself with people who challenge you. Ask better questions. And when it's time to speak, don't speak to impress. Speak to illuminate. The world doesn't need more performers. It needs more thinkers who can translate deep truth into clear language. That's what makes you powerful. That's what makes you unforgettable. But let's go even deeper. Let's talk about integrity. Because in a world dominated by false confidence, integrity becomes a radical act. But it means saying, "I don't know," when others fake certainty. It means changing your mind when new evidence appears. But it means refusing to pretend you're more competent than you are. And that kind of honesty is rare. But it's also magnetic, because people feel when someone is real. And in a sea of facades, authenticity becomes a beacon. So here's the hard truth: you will be underestimated. If you choose to think deeply, to speak carefully, to question yourself, people will sometimes mistake your humility for weakness. Let them. Because over time, the world sorts itself out. But the loud fade. The real remain. The lighthouse doesn't need to chase ships. Eventually, the ships come to it. Now, let's talk about practice. Because becoming a lighthouse isn't an idea, it's a discipline. It's built moment by moment, choice by choice. Every time you pause before reacting. Every time you ask a deeper question. Every time you resist the urge to perform. That is the training ground. That is how you rise, not in grand gestures, but in quiet decisions. Here's one. The next time someone speaks with absolute certainty about something complex, don't argue. Just ask, "How do you know?" Then listen, not to win but to see, to gauge their depth, to feel their foundation. That one question cuts through the illusion faster than any debate. Another practice: keep a not knowing journal. Every night, write down one thing you were wrong about that day, one assumption that cracked, one belief that shifted. Over time, this becomes a map not of your ignorance, but of your growth. Because the person who tracks their own blind spots becomes unshakable. And finally, seek silence. Not just external silence, but inner stillness. Because in the stillness, your mind settles, your thoughts slow, and in that space, real insight emerges. That's where the lighthouse finds its light, not from noise, but from depth. So here's the final question, the one that should echo long after this video ends. Do you want to be seen as smart, or do you want to become wise? Because those are not the same path. One is fast, loud, and full of empty victories. The other is slow, quiet, and full of deep truth. One builds a brand, the other builds a soul. and in the end, the soul wins. So yes, ignorant people often think they're geniuses. That's the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's real. It's everywhere. But the answer isn't to shout louder than the fools. It's to become something they can never fake: real, grounded, aware, reflective, a presence so clear, so rooted, so luminous that even in the chaos, people find their way home.